My name is John Hittinger, and I am the director of the John Paul II Forum. And it is my honor to introduce our guest tonight, who happens to be my brother, Russ. So it's a double pleasure for me to have him visit from the University of Tulsa, who did inspire me for arranging for two events on St. Benedict. There are a number of reasons that we're having this talk tonight, and then the first Saturday in Lent at Annunciation Parish, we'll have the abbot of the Clear Creek Benedictine Abbey in Oklahoma come to talk about the rugged road of the Beatitudes. I should also mention that for these two events, I ordered a number of copies of the Rule of Benedict, which are out on the table. And take one for free. I'd just like you all, especially students, to have the Rule of Benedict. And I also have some copies of St. Pope Gregory the Great's Life of Benedict. So please take one home. To introduce my brother, I have to tell you that we did study together at Notre Dame in the early 70s. He was a history major and I was a philosophy major. He did go to the University of St. Louis and found out his younger brother had made the better decision and studied philosophy and got his MA and PhD from the University, from St. Louis University. But he has kept a great interest in history. He is presently writing a book on the history of Catholic social thought in the last 200 years, and I'm always delighted to hear the many stories he has about the history of the papacy and the modern state over the last 200 years. I know it'll be a terrific book. He's got a contract with Yale University Press, and it should be out next year. Since 1996, he has held the William K. Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa. Since 2001, he's been a member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And in 2009, he was appointed to the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences. And he's one of two lay academics to serve on two pontifical academies. And he's been asked to chair and organize the 50th anniversary observance of Pope John XXIII's encyclical Pacem in Terris for the Holy See in Rome. But with that part of the introduction done, I would like to say a little bit about, again, the connection to St. Benedict. In 1997, Russ met the abbot of Fontainebleau and two monks who showed up in Tulsa, who happened to be Americans from Kansas, who were part of John Sr.'s program for Christian culture at the University of Kansas, who as part of their field trip went to France and visited Fontainebleau, and they were so taken by the solemn monastic order with its chant and focus on the charism of Benedict that they joined the monastery. Now you can imagine back in Kansas, that didn't play too well. I think they also both converted to the faith and joined a French Benedictine monastery. They then were sent back to the United States. Well, in 1997, when Russ met them, it turned out that Bishop Slattery was interested in bringing the monks to Oklahoma. They were going to plant the Salem monastic order in Oklahoma. So Russ was asked to assist Bishop Slattery in visiting the monks in France and helping to arrange for their coming to Oklahoma to start the monastery. They now have been elevated to the status of abbey, and Philip Anderson, the American boy from Kansas, who has spent the last 25 years in France, has been named abbot of the monastery in Oklahoma. He will visit on September 12th. Russ is an oblate of the monastery and just told me he does have the privilege of receiving the last certificate from the monastery in Fontgombeau. The rest will be granted by the abbey at Clear Creek. So let me just say, I think the talk tonight that Russ will present does have its scholarly side and its history, but I think most of all it is an interest, it will show an interest in the spiritual heritage of Saint Benedict and why Saint Benedict continues to be important for the Catholic Church today. And I may just read one sentence that struck me from the commentary on the rule by Dom Paul Delat, one of the great abbots of Salem, who said this: "Our business is not to live many years, to become learned, or to make a name in the world, but to walk to God, to get near to Him, to unite ourselves to Him." So I ask, could plainer, truer words be written? And if that's the heritage of Benedict, I think we do need to hear more about it. And I am pleased to introduce my brother Russ, who will talk about what Benedict taught the Dark Ages, his and ours. Russ, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually put another subtitle, not just what Benedict taught the Dark Ages, his and ours, but also a Lenten meditation. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, we read, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. But for all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human flesh, of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. So the Word became flesh and has made his dwelling place among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And John, who was the voice calling in the desert, testified concerning him, 'This is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me,'" unquote. And so it's in the wilderness or the desert that the gospel sounds the most profound theme of Lent, which is a light appearing in a darkness. For the Christian imagination formed in Scripture and the monastic culture, the Dark Age does not represent a period of cultural history as it did for the Renaissance. The Renaissance humanist Petrarch apparently first introduced the term tempus tenebrae, a dark time, in the 14th century in order to mark and to scorn the time in which the barbaric tribes had defiled the Latin language and literature. Enlightenment thinkers would later see the Dark Ages not so much in terms of literary snobbery, but, as Immanuel Kant put it, as a time of self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity, he explained, is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. For the monastic culture, the notion of a dark age was not drawn from history, but from theological anthropology and Christology. The story was summarized, in fact, in the first chapter of John and in the fourth chapter of Luke. Adam and his progeny were cast from a garden of delights into a desert, into what St. Augustine called the region of dissimilitude, where the race of men were caught in the brambles of sin, not knowing the light and therefore not truly understanding themselves. And so the new Adam went into the desert in search of the old Adam, praying, fasting, and being tempted by the devil for 40 days. The incarnate Word showed the way back to the house of the Father. Saint Benedict was not the first Christian who went into the desert to discover this light, but he's justly renowned for molding a simple but sturdy institution for those who are in search of it. At least in this sense, and perhaps also in an historical and cultural sense, Benedict is the patron saint of Lent. So my talk this evening consists of 4 little compositions along the lines of nocturnes. You know, in biology, a nocturne can mean a plant that flowers in the dark. And of course, nocturnes were the night offices said in a monastery, a spiritual analog to a nocturnal plant. And in modern times, a nocturne is a musical composition evoking some nighttime theme. And so my 4 nocturnes are the Owl of Minerva, Dark Ages, Curriculum, and Hearkening. I'm pleased, actually, to begin the first one by quoting Hegel, who was not a patron saint of Lent, but when Hegel said, "One more word about giving instruction as to what the world ought to be. Philosophy, in any case, always comes on the scene too late to give it. When philosophy paints its gloomy picture, then a form of life has grown old. It cannot be rejuvenated by the philosopher's gloomy picture, but only understood. Only when the dusk starts to fall does the owl of Minerva spread its wings and fly." Hegel's aphorism can be explained in different ways. Probably Hegel meant to say that life, rather than philosophy, is prescriptive. The philosopher can grasp the whole of a thing only when it's complete, in the face of which there's no point legislating what ought to be. Perhaps Hegel also means that when a civilization approaches its demise, then the owl of wisdom can take stock of its essential genius. Only at the end of a civilization do its geniuses appear, like a swan who sings one beautiful song and then dies. Therefore, the owl of Minerva takes flight not at the morning star or in the noonday sun, but only at dusk. From a monastic perspective, the Minervian moment is marked at the 7th liturgical office of the day, which Benedict calls Vespers. The word vesper is taken from Greek mythology. Hesperus is the personification of the evening star, the planet Venus in its evening appearance. And so the Vespera are the prayers at the time of shadows. Measured from the first light of morning time, the Vespera falls somewhere between the 10th and the 12th hours, between 4 and 6 p.m., depending on the season. In chapter 41 of the rule, Benedict prescribes that these prayers are to be chanted before the need of artificial light. This time is distinguished from the very end of the day, which is marked by the office of compline, from the verb complere, to complete. Compline is chanted at about 8:30 p.m., and with it the hours of the day are finished, and monks, in the hope of resurrection, submit themselves to the great silence, to a darkness that swallows all human knowledge, like the tomb that awaits every son of man. Wisdom, therefore, must come in the shadows, just as Hegel suggested, in the dusk rather than in the night, just when things are complete enough for us to take their measure and consider the world as it ought to be, but not so complete that wisdom itself slips into the oblivion of darkness. For the monastic tradition, the Vespers represent the time of judgment, of the hours of the day, of the individual soul, of a people, of the race of man. No less an authority than St. Augustine himself speculated that after Adam and Eve sinned and hid from God, He came to find and to judge them at the hour of Vespers. Why at Vespers? Augustine explains, God can judge the defendant while there's still light. Not just physical light, but the lumen cinderacis, the light of conscience, which was already beginning to be eclipsed by the shadows of sin. In the monasteries under the rule of Benedict, 4 consecutive psalms are usually chanted at Vespers. Psalm 109, he judges the nations, making their ruin complete. Psalm 110, he has shown his people the power of his works. Psalm 111, blessed is the man who fears the Lord. He shines to the righteous as a light in darkness. And Psalm 112, from the rising of the sun to its going down, let the name of the Lord be praised. Then the monks proceed to chant an ancient hymn entitled Lucis Creator, with this very important verse, Creator of light, who joins morning and the shadows, and for our instruction calls it a day. So wisdom depends on our ability to know a day and how to take its measure. And therefore, the monks were enjoined at Compline by Benedict to say with the psalmist, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. But let us return for a moment to Hegel's image of wisdom arising phoenix-like, just as a civilization moves towards its demise. The Catholic Church of late antiquity provides us with 2 such Minervian figures, Augustine and Benedict. Augustine was born in 354, the son of a minor official in a provincial town in Roman North Africa. He was formed in the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And although he bitterly complained about the intellectual shallowness and the moral turpitude of his education, anyone who would pick up his work is bedazzled by what he learned. For elegance of style, for the power of speculative intellect, Augustine was, I dare say, the greatest thinker ever produced by Roman culture. When he died in 430, his city was surrounded by Vandals. In retrospect, perhaps we're entitled to think this was the Vespers of the ancient world. For his part, Benedict was born in 480, 50 years after Augustine's death. He too came from a provincial Roman town, Nursia, today Norcia, in the mountains of Umbria, the shadow. Going back some 1,200 years, this province was the borderland of the Etruscans and the Samnite tribes. His father was a Roman civil official. As an adolescent, Benedict was sent along with his nanny to Rome to learn the very same trivium studied by Augustine. First, he needed to become a grammaticus. What was grammar? The knowledge of words. According to the ancient wisdom, everything which does not deserve to pass into oblivion has been entrusted to writing, and it belongs necessarily to the province of grammar. Like Augustine, Benedict absorbed himself in grammar, but quickly worried that rhetoric was morally corruptive. Augustine did not pray for an emancipation from rhetoric until he was in his mid-30s. Indeed, in Book 9 of the Confessions, he describes his own baptism as a liberation from rhetoric. Benedict renounced rhetoric at the age of 16. So far as we know, he studied only the first segment of the trivium, but he never renounced grammar. Indeed, his rule requires that the brothers learn to read in order to appropriate the external word of Scripture as it is on the page and as it is expressed as a liturgical word in choir. And so Benedict represents the via media between the loquacious Augustine and the hermit monk Antony, the greatest of all monks, who remained illiterate in order to attend only to the internal word that manifests itself in the desert and brambles of the soul. In any case, abandoning his formal education, Benedict tried to live the monastic life as a hermit in caves in the vicinity of Subiaco, not far from Rome. Like the desert father, St. Anthony, Benedict learned experimentally. But he became so proficient in knowledge of the divine word that other monks asked him to be their master. In the rule, Benedict says, in the prologue, he intends to found a school, a scola, for the service of God. But his first attempts to educate and govern other monks were quite troubled, to say the least. On at least 2 occasions, his monastic sons tried to murder him. Indeed, in the old-fashioned Italian way, by poisoning. Benedict, however, was discreet and prudent, eventually learning how to govern monks, even going so far as to allow a bit of wine every day to combat sadness and to relieve the temptation of murmuring. Control over murmuring is an even greater achievement than eloquence in letters. Learning by trial and error, he went on to found 13 monasteries, and moving to Monte Cassino, some 70 miles southeast of Rome, Benedict ascended the 1,800-foot-high mountain in 529, and there at the summit, over the top of the Temple of Apollo, he laid the altar for his greatest monastery. And a year later, he began writing the rule. Written in vulgar, ordinary Latin, and amounting to less than 9,000 words, it is quite different than Augustine's work. It has neither eloquence nor speculative power. Untold thousands of people have been converted by reading St. Augustine's writings. But it's hard to imagine anyone being converted merely by reading Benedict's rule. If Augustine was the greatest stylist and speculative thinker of the Roman world in its shadows, Benedict exemplified in the Vespers of that same civilization the genius unique to Rome. Romans always knew that their language and speculative tradition was inferior to the Greeks. They knew that their religion was inferior to the Eastern religions, especially the Egyptians. They knew that their aesthetics were inferior to the Greeks and the Carthaginians. Rome's destiny was different. It's what Virgil boasted of in the Aeneid. Roman, remember your strength to rule the earth's peoples, for your arts are to be these: to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, and battle down the proud, unquote. Albeit in ways unimagined and unanticipated, Benedict's rule proved to be the greatest pacification program in Western history. As the shadows had lengthened since the time of Augustine, Benedict was born 70 years after Alaric and his Vandals had sacked Rome, less than 30 years after Attila's Huns had swept through Italy, and only 2 years after the demise of the last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus. In this sense, anyway, Benedict is a kind of Minervian owl. As Roman civilization collapsed around him, he established an institution that had the stamp of Roman genius. Otherwise, there's no evidence that Benedict thought of himself or his monastic rule as either the beginning or the end of any epoch. He was a man of the ancient world. He had no intention to transmit any wisdom other than the ancient one. After all, Christianity and monasticism first arose and were practiced as an ancient wisdom. Benedict, it seems, first learned of monasticism from Syrian hermits who lived in the caves around Norcia. These and other monks simply believed that they were imitating Christ and his apostles. They read the scriptures, above all Luke 4, led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. Christ fasted, prayed, and was tempted by the devil. And we return again to this story. The first Adam sinned and was expelled from the Garden of Delights, thrown into a wilderness, like the prodigal son in the plantation of sorrows, eating food not fit for swine, and not knowing the way back to the house of the Father. And so the new Adam begins exactly where the old Adam fell. Christ goes into the desert to confront Adam's nemesis. This is an ancient story, the oldest of all stories in the monastic culture. Many things and institutions have their origin in the medieval centuries. Parliament, Romance vernaculars, the heavy plow, tidal mills, cannons, the spinning wheel, universities, glass mirrors, percussion drilling invented by Cistercians. But monasticism is not an invention of the Middle Ages. It comes instead from that ancient light discovered in the desert. In the last chapter of the rule, chapter 73, it's entitled, "The whole of just observance is not contained in this rule." Benedict insists that whatever is taught in the rule is only a part of what is transmitted by the Holy Fathers. And by the Fathers, he meant the apostles, the authors of Holy Writ, the example of the Desert Fathers, and those who had written institutes for the governance of monks. And so he concludes, "Whoever you are, quis, hastening toward your heavenly homeland, fulfill with the help of Christ this little rule for beginners." I take this to be the key sentence of the rule. Benedict founds a school for beginners. Now, to be sure, it includes rules for reading and writing, chanting, using and cleaning farm implements, greeting strangers, determining prices for goods sent to market. He prudently, almost in Chicago-style economic theory, says, monks in their humility should sell their goods under market price. Many practical details are included in the rule. And the school is free. No tuition by way of social class or money. We learn in chapter 58 that the only thing necessary for getting into one of these schools is a willing heart and adherence to the rule under the abbot. Benedict's rule is for beginners, that is, rich and poor alike. And these beginners begin where the light first appeared, in the desert. There is no other curriculum in this school. If you go to Benedict's hometown of Norcia today, a little town of maybe 4,600 souls, nested in the mountains of Umbria, you will quickly find the Piazza di San Benedetto. On the far end of the piazza stands a church and a monastery over top of the Roman-era apartment building where Benedict and his sister, St. Scholastica, were raised. In the center of the piazza is a statue of Benedict made by Giuseppe Pinzi in the late 19th century. The inscription reads, "Founder and father of monasticism in the western regions, he was driven by the Spirit to a life hidden from society, from whence there arose a renaissance of letters, the useful arts, agriculture, and sciences." The inscription is very astute. Benedict, it suggests, is the patron saint of Europe. By the way, the last part of the inscription is Norcia, our mother, of Europe. It suggests that he's the patron saint of Europe because he went into the desert. Europe's claim to fame, in other words, is not so much that it relearned and perfected the arts and sciences preserved by monks during the Dark Ages, but rather that Europe is a civilization founded in the desert. This is a quite radical claim that has been made more than once by Pope Benedict XVI, who has pointed out that the current crisis of European identity should be understood of what the Benedictines did in the wasteland. Benedict XVI asks, were they merely technicians who invented tools to till the soil, or were they about the business of clearing the weeds growing in the human soul? If Benedict's rule established nothing but a trade school for learning the useful arts, slightly eccentric monks who figured out how to build windmills, it quickly would have made itself obsolete, for it is in the very nature of a trade school to graduate its students into more advanced skills. This is how the humanists in modern times interpreted the story of Benedict's school. But if the monastic school teaches its students to awake from the mortal slumber of the old Adam, and like the prodigal, to run to the Father, no one, at least in this life, can claim to be a graduate. Benedict's school teaches the Dark Ages, his and ours, historical and spiritual, how to be a beginner. This is what he taught the Dark Ages, and it's what I suppose everyone has to relearn during Lent, as to how to be a beginner. Second, Dark Ages. It's true that the monastic centuries coincide with the Dark Ages. In the West, we are speaking roughly of 500 years from the 6th to the end of the 11th century. In 1911, the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica stated that this period from the 5th to the 10th century is called the Dark Age. Yet by the time of the Second World War, the 14th edition had a change of heart, now insisting, quote, "The contrast once so fashionable between the ages of darkness and the ages of light has no more truth in it than have the idealistic fancies which underlie attempts at medieval revivalism," unquote. And I think it is true today that no self-respecting scholar would use the term dark age or ages to periodize, categorize, or otherwise mark historical time and events, much less culture. In my view, however, it's a mistake to drop this term dark ages. The collapse of Roman order in the West was truly devastating. That Roman order was urban and urbane. In the early 5th century, it included something like 1,000 municipalities bound together by a civilian, demilitarized aristocracy that spoke Latin and Greek. At its zenith, the city of Rome had more than 1 million inhabitants, a city served by 11 aqueducts, bringing water from as far as 59 miles away over arches 100 feet tall. These cities, including those of a smaller caliber, were the center of civilization, of business, politics, fine art, patronage, libraries, buildings on a large scale, artisans, diplomacy. And the patriarchs and metropolitans of the Christian church led that church from these major cities, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Milan, Ravenna, and so forth. Stationed along this empire's borders was an army of roughly 500,000 men, along with a couple 100,000 auxiliary and part-time units, all told about the same size as the US Army and Marine Corps today. To equip and provision this enormous and highly mobile force required more than 50 state factories, which made swords and arrows, processed leather for various gear, made woolen products, such as socks and shirts. About 1/2 of the imperial budget went to feeding, equipping, and paying the army. Another 1/3 went to the maintenance of key cities, including the grain and oil handouts to urban masses, and the rest of the bureaucracy. It's estimated that just a generation before Benedict, taxes on agricultural yield from land was constant at about 25% per annum. This was the cash cow that maintained the army in the urban projects. When the barbarians penetrated and then overwhelmed the imperial armies, beginning in the 5th century, this tax revenue evaporated. What emerged in the West was a libertarian heaven. Monies for large public projects would disappear for hundreds of years. But so would cities of more than 50,000 people. Even by the 13th century, only a handful of cities in the West could support 100,000 people. London, Paris, Milan, perhaps Genoa. Okay. Some interesting facts. 4th century levels of maritime trade across the Mediterranean would not be restored until the 19th century. Drilling through the ice pack in Greenland recently, scientists have discovered that as those Roman factories closed, the pollution caused by the smelting of lead, copper, and silver fell to prehistoric levels, not to be regained until the 17th century. Pollution is an important marker of civilization. The art of making pottery on a wheel disappeared from Britain for more than 3 centuries. Abundant coinage disappeared. Household utensils, such as cups with glossy surfaces, easy to wash and easy to stack due to standardized shapes, became unknown to man. And with the demise of these cities came the demise of literacy. We read in Einhardt's Life of Charlemagne, right, in the 9th century. He could just never quite get the hang of writing. Well, I could continue in this vein, simply enumerating all of the things which vanished first from the earth and then from common human memory. But what is most important to understand for our present purpose is why the falling dominoes of the collapse of Roman order were so hard to put back into place. The answer is that the empire depended upon an extraordinarily far-flung division of labor and knowledge. A northern Italian peasant of the 3rd or 4th century might eat off of tableware from Naples, store liquids in amphorae from North Africa, sleep under a roof consisting of tiles from the south of Gaul, and be governed by a civil administrator from Tuscany. Indeed, where the Tiber snakes its way through the city of Rome, there's a place called Monte Testaccio, and here archaeologists have discovered the remains of some 53 million amphorae, all imported from Iberia, in which approximately 6 trillion liters of oil were imported from overseas. Now, one, but not the only moral of this story, is plain to see. When the lights went out, no one knew how to reproduce the whole of the civilization. Just as it would be if the lights went out in our cities. Just consider all the things you might not know how to do. Prepare a corpse for burial. Decide whether grandma's dead. Recite from memory Jewish and Christian scriptures. Throw in the Republic of Texas's Constitution. Remember all of the countries. Judge what is an authentic or an inauthentic copy of a book. Recall your paternal ancestors by name 5 generations back. Distinguish carefully between what is an established fact and what is mere speculation in any given physical science. Distinguish law from mere force. Distinguish what is pleasant to the senses from what is good. Distinguish what is good from what is morally good. Distinguish between transitory relationships keyed to survival and enduring memberships, such as one's status in a family or in a polity. And to do all of these things, not in the lonely privacy of one's own opinion, nor in a series of random precautions taken by a crowd, but in the light of common institutions. But I want to here pause to say a dark age does not consist merely of technological ignorance. Worse yet is having forgotten how to live a good life rather than a life of mere subsistence. In a life of mere subsistence, every day becomes a disorganized disaster. It's worth recalling, reflecting on the possibility that technology alone is not the only factor that marks a civilization from a dark age. The European Dark Ages teach us that the more diversified the functions of a civilization, all the more necessary that at least some people know what is a life worth living, not merely a life worth enduring. The Dark Ages were dark because people forgot what the Owl of Minerva understands, namely, the way the world ought to be, or at least the way it once was. In the West of the 7th century, a people who had lived for all of these centuries, 2 millennia, were handed over to a rural existence under the sway of illiterate chieftains who gave land to heavily armed men on horseback in exchange for military service. If you were fortunate, you might come under a little bit of Lombard law. Consider, for example, Edict 47 of King Rothar's law, mid-7th century. Quote, "He who hits another man on the head so that the bones are broken shall pay 12 solidi as compensation if one bone is broken. He shall pay 24 solidi as compensation if 2 bones are broken, 36 solidi for 3 bones. If there are more bones broken than this, they are not to be counted." What constitutes a broken bone? The sound it makes against a shield that can be heard at a distance of 12 feet. I'm still quoting, "And this measure indeed should be taken by the foot of a medium-sized man." Not even Monty Python could capture this beautifully primitive jurisprudence of various and sundry body parts. Benedict's school forbade one brother from striking another, chapter 70. And it was the school of one man not striking another that was implanted by Pope Gregory the Great in Kent in 576. All of Western Europe had been turned into a wilderness, and there were two kinds of people who felt right at home. Heavily armed young men, constituted in raiding parties, and monks under the rule of Benedict. You will discover when you read the rule that in addition to the vow of poverty and chastity and obedience, the Benedictine monks also promised stability and reform of manners. Stability was perhaps the most important vow for these historical Dark Ages. Unlike the warrior class that was mobile, just short of being nomadic, monks would arrive, clear the forest, irrigate, and cultivate the land, and stay there. Within earshot of the bells, lay people could begin again to measure time, to have families. The rise of family life in the Middle Ages is key to these monastic settlements. From monks, lay people could learn how to properly bury the dead, how to read and write, how to do things which transcend a life of mere subsistence. Well, we can say this is also what Benedict taught the Dark Ages, how to live life as a whole, not necessarily a life of worldly success, but one of human success. Not only how to divide a day, but how to divide it unto wisdom. Curriculum, my third point. Benedict taught an integrated knowledge along three fronts. He taught materially, politically, and poetically. But it's the poetic that suffuses the Benedictine school. First, as regards the material of life, nothing is more important than light and dark. Namely, to provide an answer to the question, what suffices for a day? Infants and very young children are ignorant of what constitutes a day. And I am told that even college students have problems in this regard. That a collegiate day is something like a 24/7 flow of flickering images resembling a casino in Nevada or Oklahoma. Like the practical wisdom displayed by God in Genesis, Benedict begins with a day equally measured, 8 hours of prayer, 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of rest, adjusted for the seasons. A day having been properly established, the rule then prescribes a unity of things which the ancient world had kept apart. On the one hand, the free or liberal arts and sciences cultivated and practiced by the nobility. This was called universitas personarum, things tending toward one in and for the dignity of human persons. On the other hand stood the work of artisans and manual laborers. This was called universitas rerum, a unity for the sake of the things being organized, the bricks, the streets, the monies. Benedict taught the proper order of these things, tools for the sake of monks, monks for the sake of God, and a hierarchy of action without distinction by class. In the ancient world, personal dignity was measured by its remotion or distance from tools and labor. Indeed, the rural warrior class of the Middle Ages never worked the land. What did they do with their hands? They killed, but they did not work with them. Benedict's motto was ora et labora, prayer and work. The monks, therefore, are contemplatives and laborers, Jedi who work with their hands. Reading is essential to Benedict's school, for it joins together prayer and work. Consider the actions associated with reading: speaking, meditating, cogitating, imagining, remembering, understanding, desiring. By summoning so many different mental actions and physical postures, reading can be profoundly integrative. It forms a clearing in the forest of sensations of the soul and creates a place for study and prayer. And thus, Lent really should be a time for reading, at least in the sense it was understood by the monastic culture. I say he also taught politically. As regards the social organization of the human persons in a monastery, let me briefly mention three things that are at least important from a sociological perspective. First, the monastery is characterized by easy entrance and difficult exit. The monastery is a voluntary society that's not especially picky about who joins. Within a month or so, the applicant is inside the walls. A few years later, he or she is professed, and solemnly professed a few years after that. But the learning curve is very long, the rest of one's life. Second, each abbey is quasi-autonomous and self-sufficient under the rule of their own abbot. The key to this self-sufficiency is the vow of stability. This is the Benedictine understanding of 1 Peter 2:5. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. Third, the Benedictine rule emphasizes equality. For most public purposes in the monastery, monks are distinguished only by their date of entrance. That is, according to a principle of seniority. Even the youngest monks can vote in an abbatial election. All of these add up to a pretty sturdy social structure in the wilderness. Literate men and women, under a common rule, knowing how to divide a day, how to live a stable life in a certain place, not only within a day, but over years, competent to contemplate and to work with their hands, having as their only standard of admission that the novice have a willing heart, and all of them counting themselves beginners from the day they enter until they die. From inside the monastic perspective, it really doesn't matter too much whether the whole thing is destroyed, so long as it starts again, because it was never meant to be anything but a school for beginners. I mean, if Harvard or Yale or Oxford were to be destroyed, we say, for heaven's sakes, how can we ever reproduce this? But a monastery is not Harvard. It's a school for beginners. Just start again. There will always be another child of the old Adam who awakes from slumber and wants to become a brother. Thirdly, and most importantly, if a rule for beginners is to take root, it has to do so in a way fit for a child, or at least someone childlike. And one teaches a child through the senses and the imagination. In one of his greatest essays, John Henry Newman, it's called The Mission of St. Benedict. It was published in Atlantis magazine in January 1858. He reckoned Benedict taught poetically. And by poetry, Newman did not necessarily mean the craft of poetry, which is the craft of constructing metered verse. Rather, he meant a way of learning that arises from sense, experience, and imagination. Its special feature is wonder, or what the Latin-speaking peoples called admiratio, admiration, taking from the adjective mirus, or wonderful. We should call it knowledge touched by the thing being known. This is how Aristotle begins. All philosophy begins in wonder. Thelma, a miracle. Thaumazo, to admire. By nature, all men desire to know. This is what I mean by knowledge touched by the thing being known. Here then is Newman, addressing what he thinks is the genius of the Benedictine method. I quote, "Reason investigates, analyzes, numbers, weighs, measures, ascertains, locates its objects of contemplation, and therefore gains a scientific knowledge of them. Science results in a system, a complex unity. Poetry delights in the indefinite and the various, in contrast with unity, and in the simple, in contrast to the system. The aim of science is to get a hold of things, to grasp them and to handle them and to comprehend them. That is, to master them. But as to the poetical, very different is the frame of mind, which is necessary for its perception. It demands as its primary condition that we should not put ourselves above the objects in which it resides, but at their feet. That we should feel them to be above and beyond us. We should look up to them. And that instead of fancying that we can comprehend them, we should take for granted that we are surrounded and comprehended by them ourselves. Hence, it is a child's mind that's full of poetry because he knows so little as beginners. And an old man of the world so devoid of poetry because his experience of facts is so wide." Unquote. So as Newman saw it, The scientific mentality requires one to stand above the things being studied. The dignity of the mind replaces the dignity of the object. Poetic learning is for the youth, scientific proof for the mature, and perhaps wisdom for the old. But wisdom is more like poetry than proof. In Latin, the word sapiens, after all, denotes a person who can savor or taste. Wisdom is knowing how to savor. And therefore, in chapter 19 of the Rule, Benedict prescribes that psalms are to be chanted sapienter, wisely. In his way, in his Life of Benedict, Pope Gregory the Great comments that Benedict was scienter necius et sapienter indoctus, learnedly ignorant and wisely uninstructed. Benedict did not have a scientific theology for the Psalms, but a rule for the savoring of them. This was the rule written for a youth in a world grown old. Not the world as it ought to be, but alas, cannot be. Rather, the world as seen by a youth, which is to say a world that is admired the way it appears, and is first known through a contact suffused with emotion. Newman refers to the poetry of life and the poetry of ceremonies, the cowl, the cloister, and the choir, all very Harry Potterish. But first it's the black hood, the cowl, or what was called the cuculus, which was a poncho worn by children in ancient Rome. Then the cloister, the internal space of the monastery, like a child's bedroom in the house. Finally, the choir, which is the place of beauty. Newman notes that in this kind of world, a person can take each new day as a whole in itself and doing works which cannot be cut short, for they are complete in every portion of them. Imagine now chanting all 150 psalms every week. The variety of images, moods, and emotions. Each psalm is chanted and is complete in itself. One psalm repeatedly is complemented by the next psalm and the next office and the next day, without any effort to tie all the disparate parts together into a scientific system. Above all, one becomes aware of the slowness of the good. We remember, all of us remember, what it was like to learn that way when we were younger, when a summer seemed like a lifetime, when almost effortlessly a youth can learn more in 3 months than an adult in 3 years. The life envisaged by Benedict is not like a 5-year plan or a senior thesis or a job report. The monk's life is rolled out like the verses of a psalm, little parts which cumulatively become something more. And this, indeed, is what Benedict taught the Dark Ages, his and now. The slowness of the good, which is experienced as incredibly rich if one becomes as a child. This recalls Tertullian, and what Tertullian said of the incarnate Christ, that he suffered himself to be conceived in a mother's womb and wished himself to be sated with the pleasure of patience. In the Middle Ages, Lent was taken from a Germanic word for long, but the Latin adverb lente, slowly, is probably the better term. My final nocturne, hearkening. So let me take you to the beginning of the rule. The first words. Hearken, my son, and with the ear of your heart hear the precepts of the master. The poetical approach jumps right off of the page. Hearken. Not read, study, or merely listen. To hearken is to attend to something that's immediate. It's the notion of knowledge touched by the thing being known is highlighted. Here, by means of the scriptural image of the ear of one's heart, one is bidden to incline, to turn towards something as from an inner principle. Benedict continues, readily, libenter, accept and faithfully follow the advice of your pious father, so that through the labor of obedience you may return to him from whom you have withdrawn because of the laziness of disobedience. My words are meant for you, whoever you are, quis again, who laying aside your own will, take up the powerful and righteous arms of obedience. And right here, Benedict embeds the story of the prodigal son. The filius or philia, who turns to the voice of the Father. He said, "Therefore let us arise," Luke 15:20, and arising he went unto the Father. The text then shifts to the verb absculta, hearken, heed, from that to its linguistic sister, obdire, to listen toward a word, to obey. Benedict's student would have been familiar not only with the story of the prodigal son, but also with the ideal of the Roman father. The pater familias, who has by right the office of domestic magistrate, invested with public charge inside his household, even including capital powers of life and death over his wife, sons, slaves, and domestic animals. In the Roman world, what does the son owe to the father, and the father to the city, and to the city to the protecting gods? Pietas. It's a kind of reverence of an inferior to a superior. More precisely, pietas is the proper response on the part of someone who can never pay back what is received. But it's clear that in the prologue of Benedict's rule, he is not referring to that kind of daddy. In fact, the word pater familias is only used once in the rule, in chapter 2, and it pertains to Christ as the Good Shepherd. But here's what's important. Benedict refers to a father who is himself pious, pater piissime, a tender and merciful father who has the virtue of piety toward what is lower than himself, to the human being created in his image. And so now we come back to the prodigal, the father who from afar sees the son trying to return, but who takes the initiative. This is not the stern Roman pater. The monastery is a school of the pater noster, again, a school for beginners. So let me take you to one more paragraph in the prologue to the rule. Here we read, "Let us then at last arise, since Scripture arouses us, saying, it is now time for us to rise from sleep." Now, interesting, Benedict has embedded Lazarus from John 11. Lazare veni foras, come out, into the story of the prodigal, come back, and Easter into the story of the Passion, arise. The paragraph continues, "And let us open our eyes to the deifying light, and let us attune our ears to what the divine voice admonishes, daily crying out today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts." Here it seems Benedict is evoking, paraphrasing, along with Scripture, a favorite communion chant of the early church. "Come, O sons, listen, O taste and see, and be radiant." In the prologue, indeed, he writes, "Hasten while you have the light of life." So, Father Benedict teaches according to these verbs. Hearken, hasten, awaken, arise, turn, obey, leave aside, listen, incline. The whole prologue just bristles in this mood. But in a way, it's a mood that's strangely soothing. One reason, perhaps, is precisely what the ear of the heart desires. Benedict requires that when the bells summon to prayer 8 times a day, the monk must drop everything and turn toward the sound. Incline, awake, arise, hearken, and go to prayer. The most famous monk of the Middle Ages, Bernard of Clairvaux, said that as sin entered the world first through sight, beholding with envy the fruit of the tree, so salvation first comes through the ear. We recall Deuteronomy 6:4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." And so we have a splendidly simple reenactment or recapitulation of the gospel. Come back, come out, arise. 8 times a day, 56 times a week, one leaves everything behind and turns to the voice. And Benedict writes, "And if you say, ego, I'm the one, echo me, here I am," then Benedict says, here is the school for the doing of it. Quote, "And in instituting it, we hope to establish nothing harsh or oppressive. Whatever rules are laid down for correcting vices, maintaining equity, conserving the order of love, will be hard at the beginning, but not overwhelming." And so now I can conclude by suggesting what Benedict taught the Dark Ages. Not from a standpoint external to the rule, judgments of history or economics or aesthetics or agricultural sciences and arts, but from a point of view internal to the rule. The monastic school does not exist for the purpose of surviving Dark Ages or for helping barbarians to learn to count on something other than their fingers. Benedict taught the monks to have a certain contempt for all of that. Not a naive or callous disregard of the fact of the world's ignorance or misery. It's not disregard of the world, because you can read for yourself the chapters on feeding the poor and welcoming strangers. Rather, he taught the monks that there is something better to do, something higher and more worthy of their daily labor. That is, the monastery is nothing other than a school that turns prodigals into pilgrims, beginners. And that is what we become, once again, on Ash Wednesday. And for the rest, I commend you to Abbot Philip Anderson, who will speak on more profound things, I'm sure, of the rugged way of the Beatitudes. Thank you.
Beautiful talk, sir. But I'm wondering, looking from the standpoint of academia, which today is anything but the descendant of a monastically conceived university, where we have to deal with the rather muscular counterculture of Gramsci and Benjamin and Marx and Nietzsche and so forth and so on. I wonder, can we do this with this school for beginners? Don't we need something more muscular? End of question.
Well, I have a beginning of an answer for that. The first fruit of the gospel really is the pater noster. That is, the first thing that has to be appropriated from the life of Christ is to be right with the Father. The entire mission is first become right with the Father. And that's what the Benedictine school excels at. But as the Middle Ages went on, we find new religious groups that want to emphasize being right with your brother. I'm thinking of the mendicant orders, especially. And you can say that the Dominican and Franciscan charism is a kind of excellence that depends upon having first been right with the Father. Take a Dominican or a Franciscan or a Jesuit and uproot being right with your brother from Benedict school, and it's disaster. Okay, so the evolution, by the way, when Newman set out to write that essay, what Benedict, the mission of St. Benedict, he said there are three ways the saints have taught the church. The school of Benedict, which is the school of poetry, the school of Dominic, which is the school of science, and the school of Ignatius, which is the school of practice, prudence. He never got around to writing the second two. And I think I know why. Newman, who is surely a man of the academic life, because I think he perceived how important that first moment is. And even in academia, until recently, was still organized somewhat monastically, not just with regard to the subjects being learned, but how people lived. I mean, all those colleges in Oxford and so forth were organized somewhat monastically with the offices and the duties, the cloister, that there's something essential in this stage. And if modern people want to be more grown up than being a filius, let them do it. And I suppose we must. But the Benedictine moment is always there. I remind you that Francis of Assisi went to Subiaco, and the Benedictines were constantly providing the haven for St. Francis. The best image we have of St. Francis to this day is in Subiaco. the Dominicans kept the choir. They kept much of what Benedict taught, even though their orientation was to a kind of constitutional brotherhood. And Ignatius, when Ignatius was converted, where is the first place he goes? Montserrat, to the Benedictine monastery. There's an old pattern, even among the more active and muscular charisms of the church, that keeps contact with what Benedict, his simple school. And so my answer, just for starters, would be this. The effort to be more muscular, especially intellectually, more active, more mobile, yields very little fruit if it's not on the shoulders of this. And we see it around us all the time. Now, a Benedictine monastery is not for everyone at the same time. But what it includes is for everyone, as I understand it. We'll have more muscular intellectual Christianity again when this is rediscovered. Perhaps. Randy.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. Two questions. A, how is ours, I think.
Yeah.
How is ours a dark age in a good way? I mean, how is ours a dark age? And what does Benedict have to teach those of us who are perhaps not called to enter a monastery?
Okay. Well, as I said, a dark age is not just technological ignorance, although technological ignorance is a crucial part of the story, the historical story. Okay. What I was trying to bring out is this, and I should have said something about the liberal arts as they were once understood. The value of liberal arts is synthetic, that they teach not just use of the tool, but to know what the Minervian owl knows, the way the world ought to be, something complete, something whole. Where that does not exist, we're in a dark age, in one sense. Say, culturally, civilizationally, it's a kind of dark age. No one knows how it all fits together. And of those questions I asked, every one of them still pertains today. I mean, is grandma dead? Should babies be conceived through an act of sexual intercourse or in a petri dish? I don't know. I mean, should we bury the dead? Should we burn them? How to divide a day? Let's go back, because as I said, in the material, Benedict starts where Genesis starts. You've got to understand what a day is in more than one sense. But let's just start with the obvious sense of how to divide one and to live in it. I hope I'm not being too cranky when I say that this has been removed from the memory of man. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone else on this. I mean, a day has no structural meaning anymore. How can you live a human life? So I was careful to select those examples to make sure that no one of them depended entirely on technology. Notice some of them depend upon memory, your paternal ancestors 5 generations back. Ask your students. So one meaning of a dark age, it seems to apply today. Now, it applied in Benedict's time, perhaps, how to put it, there was an even greater crisis because of the lack of common institutions that preserved memory about how to do this and the practice of it. That kind of dark age, it seems to me, can coexist with technological prowess. In fact, technological prowess without knowing how to divide a day is just a disaster. Okay, I mean, I have my iPhone on me somewhere to prove it. But now, that's not the only notion of the dark. It's a certain external in this world, historical, cultural, anthropological understanding of not knowing what is a life beyond mere subsistence, running from one thing to the other, to the other, to the other. And people have opinions about how to bury the dead, or whether babies should be conceived through sexual intercourse rather than petri dish. People have opinions about all these things, but these opinions are tragically, devastatingly left to the privacy of your own opinion. And except for a desert father like Antony, to be left to opinions which you believe to be true in the privacy, simply of your own mind without common institutions and communication with others. I can recommend a great book on this very scenario by the guy who's called the Swedish Flannery O'Connor. His name is Torgny Lindgren. And his books, most of them are translated into English, but the one that I think is best to read is called Light. And it's about a Swedish rural town, village really, at the time of the bubonic plague, in which someone brings a rabbit into town, brings the plague. All but 5 people die. And they have some opinions about what they should do. But they're not quite sure. They're not quite sure. Without common institutions to preserve these, and a kind of publicity of the truth, not just your own private estimations, or not just being an opinionator about it, but being in a common life with others about it. It's a beautiful novel. I can't tell you what the ending is. A solution comes to these very puzzled villagers. A wild boar kills one of the children and begins to eat it. And they ask, what should we do? I mean, the girl is dead. Should we kill it? Should we kill it? What's the deal here? Well, my opinion is this, and my opinion is that. No, the most basic things of life can't just be in the privacy of one's own opinion. It's not like Rush Limbaugh. It's not just having opinions, it's having a common culture in which things are tied together, mutually reinforced. Where there is only the opinion, that is a kind of dark age. That's a dark age. Plato spoke about it in the allegory of the cave. There are other meanings of dark age, and the monastery, the rule of Benedict is organized primarily around that deeper meaning, right? Which is there in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. Okay. I mean, all of these are interrelated. I mean, they have to be properly subordinated, one to the other. But all of this can exist even with amazing technological proficiency, is my point.
Russ, I've got one over here.
Twice you mentioned St. Benedict and St. Augustine having been well trained in the trivium, but you would not call them educated unless they were also familiar with the quadrivium, the arithmetic, geometry, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So where does that come in? How did it get lost from Athens, and where does it come back into our civilization? Where I find it a very, very small minority familiar with both.
Indeed. In Athanasius's life of Antony, there's a very interesting scene where the Greek philosophers go into the desert to find Antony because they hear he's a wonder worker. And they find this illiterate man. And they say, how can you be wise without letters? And Antony says, does the mind make letters, or do letters make the mind? And they say, well, of course, the mind makes letters. And he just leads them through a kind of Platonic understanding of the proper hierarchy of this, that mind is more important than its productions and so on and so forth. I think in the monastic culture, there's already a seed of wanting the fully integrated knowledge, but they go about integrating it much more slowly, right, than the medieval university. They do it much more slowly by savoring, allowing one thing to roll into another and then gathering it up. And whereas the medieval university, of course, brings back the whole thing and more besides, with a kind of division of labor and of disciplines and so on and so forth. So I'm not here arguing for a monastic piety that is contrary to trivium and quadrivium and more besides, but just that its central insight seems to be what a trivium and a quadrivium require, just like in the story of Antony being confronted by the Greek philosophers. If you don't know that mind is higher than letters, what good is the study of these letters? Augustine asks the very same question in the Confessions when he says, when Ambrose began to teach him the scriptures, he said, I did not yet know that I was made unto the image and likeness of God. That is, I didn't know that I had a mind, in the full sense of the term, that I had a spiritual power, right? And until he could slowly discover that, he did not regard himself as competent to explicate the letter, at least of the scriptural page. So my argument is that there's something absolutely primeval and crucial in the kind of unity, moral unity and material unity and imaginative unity of the monastic school. I am not one of these kinds of thinkers, being a Thomist myself. I'm not one of the kind of thinkers who believe that the monastic school is piety to be used as a sword or as a cudgel against the university. I have nothing to do with that. Only that the university, without a living memory of the monastic school, goes awry. And you see what's happened to the trivium and quadrivium for us, right? They're vanished. People no longer know they're made in the image and likeness of God. They have no sense of the soul. And, well, you can teach these kinds of people all day long, and it bears no fruit, or very little fruit. That does sound cranky, and maybe I should qualify that. But in Book 10 of the Confessions, chapter 6, Augustine says, and I went to the world of senses, and all the senses reported the signs of creation, and those signs all said, we are not God. He says, the signs say the same thing all of the time to all men, but some men do not interpret. Right? So this kind of moral and spiritual point of the Benedictine school and other monastic schools seems to me an absolutely crucial training ground for entering into higher studies and more scientifically organized studies. I think that was Newman's point on it, because Newman was not an anti-intellectual or, this kind of thing.
Should we do one more, Russ? You're still
Okay, sure.
at it? Okay.
Dr. Hittinger, thank you for just a marvelous set of meditations. Your answer to Dr. Smith's question and your remarks upon the noise of opinion raised in my mind a question about a possible Benedictine contrast between the darkness of murmuring, that noise of opinion, and authentic, rooted conversation, ordered in time, rooted in place. And I wonder what you how you understand that difficult phrase in the rule, difficult to translate, conversatio mororum suorum. You imply that it might be translated reform of manners.
Right.
I've seen it translated as, fidelity to monastic life,
Right.
or, continuing conversion of life, but it's not conversio, it's conversatio.
Right.
And I wonder if there's a kind of dialogical, personalist, conversational dimension
Right.
to Benedictine life, inclining the ears of your heart to listen, but then what's the form of the response?
And of course, the response is the liturgical word primarily. At least for a certain kind of monasticism, the solemn, certainly that kind of monasticism, the response publicly and primarily is the chant and the liturgical word, but it's also the interior word without syllables, which is from Lectio Divina, the response to the page, the printed page, or as Augustine would say, finding the stags under the woods of the pages of the trees. It's also the dialogue inside the monastery, because a Benedictine monastery is, of course, under a great silence, but not under a total silence, right? And chapter is very important. It's a very important colloquy between the abbot and the monks daily, if the monastery is working correctly. It's daily. And Benedict urges the abbot to have a council and to take the advice of the younger monks. I like to tell students when I teach this that when you go to the River Thames, there you see these two great institutions. On one side is Westminster Abbey, and on the other side is Parliament. Guess which one came 6 centuries earlier? Because Parliament is where you speak. That is a parliament. It's where people come together to exchange. And the Benedictines were first doing that. Now, not in the sense of the political deliberation of a polity, a full-fledged polity. But no, I agree that reform of manners or of mores means more than one thing. It at least means this. It doesn't mean just being able to eat properly and not to hit your brother. It means learning how to live monastically. And murmuring, not to murmur, is in that sense, it's a reform, not murmuring. Or he also goes after certain kinds of laughter. That is, it's not a place for hanging around the water cooler telling jokes and gossip, right? In fact, in a Benedictine monastery, the noonday devil is identified with gossip. That is, at the middle of the day, the tendency to start gossiping, right? But these are all learning how to live monastically. It's not just table manners, of course. But to learn how to live that way for Benedict is, and for his school, it's for the rest of your life. Although he does admit that from this school, certain extraordinary people can become hermits. Right? They become a monastery in themselves, in a way. But the sturdier type of monk, he says, is the Cenobite, because of the sturdiness of the learning and the community, but primarily the abbot. Because Benedictinism is not a community that then goes in search of an authority. Like any organized group needs an authority. But the monastery is not primarily a community of that sort. It's putting yourself under the abbot, becoming a son of that abbot, just like in the desert they would go to Antony or whatnot, except this is institutionalized. So abbatial authority in the figure of the abbot is absolutely crucial, and it cannot be reduced to the community. And this is why, if you go to earlier monastic rules, Cashin or the Rule of the Master, all of the admonitions are to the monks. In the Rule of Benedict, they're all to the abbot. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Russ for an inspiring talk. Good. Thank you.